The expectations for today, please have a look at the slide. We are launching the casework operating manual for managing domestic abuse cases. This was one of your pre-readings. This resource aims to support the caseworker to recognize, respond, and support clients in disclosures of domestic abuse in the safest way. And these sessions aim to be practical and challenging sessions around the key elements of the manual. We are starting from the assumption that you're involved in domestic abuse cases to a varying degree, and you'll hear casework tips, practical casework tips throughout, as Sarah Robb has experience of the London everyday casework practice, and remember it might differ from your area. But you are the experts in your field, so please contribute proactively, as you can also learn from each other. We can also learn from each other. So if everyone is here, I will send you a link to our first activity. It's going to be on Mentimeter. Let me send it on chat, and I'll put it there. Everyone, yes. This is the direct link. Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong. Voila. I'll escape slightly. So there, if you go on the link that I sent on the chat, or www.menti.com, and enter the following code 3296713. I've got it on here. Okay.
Sorry, can you give us the code again, please?
Yes, 3296713.
Thank you.
And the last one. Mixed answers. Oh, look at the points. Okay.
Sorry, that was unfair as well. I wanted to check it all worked, but obviously I got a bit excited as well. That's completely unfair, so I don't count as the winner. Whoever was next was 100% the winner.
We've got
But
Sherry.
we know that it works and that I have very quick.
You've got a wonderful Rose. Thank you. We do like a little challenge here. Yeah, so let's just go through some of the okay, end of the presentation. Let me see if I can go back to our slideshow. Okay, so how did you find it? This was really a quick quiz that recaps some of the pre-learning and some of the things that we will discuss today. So don't worry if some of the answers were not, you know, some of the questions were not very clear. But any feedback from anybody?
Can I ask a question, please? The last question asked whether a woman can approach any local authority to access support around domestic abuse. In our experience at the local Red Cross, when we did encourage someone to approach another local authority, they were turned away. That was over a year ago, so things may have changed. So just wanted to ask whether you have any additional information to provide us around entitlements in relation to other local authorities. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in on that one, Virginia, if you want me to. So,
No, of course.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So that is often the case, that they will kind of turn someone away and say this isn't your local connection. But I think we circulated it before the training, but it will be circulated afterwards as well. That chapter 21 of the homelessness guidance is really helpful because it goes through domestic abuse like step by step in terms of kind of priority need, intentionality, local connection, all of those things, which we'll touch on later at the end. But a woman fleeing domestic abuse can approach any local authority, but often local authorities don't abide by that, so it can be a bit of a push and a bit of a fight. So it's not uncommon to see it, but there is the provision there. Hopefully that kind of makes that clear.
Thank you. Okay, so I've kept a few slides that if you attended previous sessions, you will have seen already. So this is a definition of domestic abuse from a Home Office definition, and it's just to remind that that there are different types of domestic abuse, and it's not limited to physical abuse, but it can be sexual, psychological, it can have financial elements. There's coercive and controlling behavior. It can include honor-based violence or online type of abuse. In this training, we will assume that it's husband and wife, but of course, the wife can be a perpetrator, or other family members can be the perpetrators. Children witnessing domestic abuse is a form of domestic abuse in itself. And it's also domestic abuse where you've got older children, teenager type of age, who speak maybe more English, and that can be relevant to our RFL clients, and they can exert abuse towards their parents. This is, I put some definitions in the next few slides. It's just to remind that control and coercion is often part of domestic abuse. So can be stalking, domestic abuse, as I said, is not only physical violence of assault, but can also include other elements, and these are relatively new offenses and have separate legal definitions. You can read them in your time as a handout, and similar to stalking and harassment, which are common elements that a client might disclose. Safeguarding. So here's a slide. We always report domestic abuse to the safeguarding team at the earliest opportunity. And those who attended the first session, Helen McCormick came to the first meeting and reminded us that the vast majority of cases at the Red Cross are properly documented, but it can be tricky on a few cases and can have dangerous consequences for a survivor or her family. We do not offer specialist domestic abuse service. So the importance of safeguarding in this context is that if we don't report, or a lack of proper reporting can make us individually, first of all, vulnerable individually, first of all as staff, and obviously it has consequences for the client. And not having oversight, you might have a lack of proper advice, and it has an importance from an organizational support, taking some of the burden away, and that's beyond the psychosocial support that we can also access as staff and volunteers. And because all domestic abuse cases are considered high risk, it's important to share decisions that are made. So I've been asked to remind that the safeguarding team is in the process of developing e-modules on domestic abuse safeguarding, and that will be rolled out in 2021 from a core level. So it will be general for the whole of the Red Cross, and then it will also develop an advanced version for RSRFL specifically. So look out for these trainings. So unless there are any questions, we can move on to the next section, and Sarah will lead on this.
Okay, so in this bit, before we go into doing an activity, we're gonna have a think about understanding risk in relation to domestic abuse. So you can see on the screen on the PowerPoint, there's a photo of someone standing on a chair in socks, in baggy trousers. Now, this is just a very simple photograph, probably potentially not with the right copyright because there's a big thing, watermark over it. But this is simply to show that there's risk in everything that we work with. We're never not working with risk. So it's to, I guess, work out how we can best manage risk and understand it in domestic abuse in this context. So there's kind of different theoretical perspectives, and we're not going to kind of bore you with too much theory and that side of it today, but I think it's really important to ground it in that first before we think about the practical sides of things and kind of draw this into casework examples of when we're working in these situations. So a lady called Liz Kelly developed the 6 stages of domestic abuse. Now, there's various different kind of theoretical perspectives. Some have 8 stages, some have 6 stages, but they all kind of pin around the same key points. This one is referred to in the domestic abuse kind of guidance from the Red Cross, so you may have seen it there. So I'm just going to kind of whiz through these, but it's just as a reference point to kind of understand. So in situations of domestic abuse, there's a point where it starts. There's a point where violence and abuse starts. That can be emotional, physical, psychological, financial, any of those forms that there are within kind of domestic abuse. And that's that first point in managing the situation, and they'll try and find kind of, most survivors or victims will try and find a explanation for the situation, and develop strategies at this point, start to develop strategies of how they will then manage this moving forward. It's very rare that after the first incident, someone wants to leave the relationship or leave the perpetrator. That is very, very rare. The next stage is kind of a distortion of reality or perspective. And this gradually, it starts impacting the individual's daily life who's experiencing domestic abuse. And their thought processes are affected by the violence and working out, how do I constantly manage this and change my behavior, asking kind of why. They're often taking responsibility that it's their fault, for this is the reason why it's happening, and coping. This is the stage where it's just, okay, just coping, just trying to do anything to ensure that you don't get those consequences of abuse and violence. And then stage number 3 is defining abuse. Now, it's only after kind of several incidents or kind of an ongoing pattern of this where individuals will actually identify this as violence. And I think that's really important to understand in terms of the people that we're working with, that it's not necessarily from the first point that it's maybe defined as that by them. And then that's maybe when the reevaluation of the relationship starts, where they begin to kind of start thinking about, can I stop this? Can I minimize this? And what does it mean to leave? And then you have the point of ending the relationship. Now, many people that we work with and many people who are in situations of domestic abuse try to leave many times and think about leaving on many occasions before they actually do. And kind of then that leads on to the next point, that ending the relationship doesn't necessarily mean ending abuse. You know, we know that when somebody leaves a situation of domestic abuse, they're at the highest risk of domestic homicide. Research tells us that, evidence tells us that, and it's quite common. Most of these kind of stages and these kind of theoretical perspectives around domestic abuse, they're based on research and evidence and talking with those who have experienced domestic abuse. So kind of these are evidence-based research kind of theoretical perspectives, and most of them are shown as cycles, as circles, because, you know, somebody may go from stage 1 to stage 2 to 3 to 4 and then back to 1. You know, there can be a consistent cycle before somebody is ready to leave. So it's just kind of thinking about that context when we're thinking about domestic abuse. It's likely that if somebody leaves, they'll return. That is not uncommon. That doesn't mean that, you know, we've done a bad job in terms of casework. It doesn't mean any of those things, but it is highly likely that when someone leaves a situation of domestic abuse, that's not the kind of final time that they will end the relationship. Virginia, can you go to the next slide, please? So I mentioned just before that, when somebody leaves a relationship, they're at the highest risk of death. Perpetrators then kind of, they've lost everything, and in that sense, and that's where we see the highest number of domestic homicides. But there are certain things that indicate risks in case of domestic abuse. Now, this training is specifically focusing on this. There are different tools to assess risks, and I think it's always reminding ourselves we are not domestic abuse specialists. We are not. We're not trained to be that, and that is not our role. And it would be wrong of us to assume that role and to take that on. But actually, it's really helpful in terms of our casework. And, you know, the reality is I know this, we are working with people who are in situations of domestic abuse. And sometimes we have to do the initial risk assessment before a specialist agency is involved. So we do need to have some tools and ideas of how we assess risks in those initial stages before there's a specialist involved, because at the minute of disclosure, I know most of us don't have a domestic abuse, you know, service sat next to us, where we can just immediately refer. We need to think about how we assess those risks while we're waiting and whilst we're trying to put a plan together of what next. But
Sorry,
there
can
are
I just
Yep.
ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Has a decision been made that we definitely will not be trained in doing these risk assessments? Because I know that was an ongoing discussion.
Yeah,
for a while.
I don't think I can probably. I think I'm probably not the person who can comment on that. I think we're not.
I
we're
don't
not
think there's
trained.
been a decision.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's my understanding. So at the moment, we're still a place, and also it's just saying that different people will have different levels of experience.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to check because I
but,
knew that was a conversation that was going on.
Yeah, like
Yeah, there are a few
currently,
things.
as much as I know, is that it's not being like rolled out. So it's kind of trying to hold that space while anything else comes about, is trying to hold that space so we're not without nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's that
No,
kind of in
thank you.
between, like the betwixt and between, I think is probably where we are at the moment, maybe a good way to put it. And I think maybe what you're referring to is like the DASH risk assessment, but it may not have been. But a tool that is used by domestic abuse specialists is the DASH risk assessment tool. Some of you may have heard of it before, some of you may not. Now you can kind of look it up in your own time. It was developed a number of years ago to have a standardized tool to assess the level of risk in domestic abuse cases. We are not trained on doing it, but it's an evidence-based tool when reviewing kind of cases of domestic homicide of what made these cases more risky. And it's used when somebody's going to be referred into MARAC, which is a multi-agency risk assessment conference, which is for cases of high risk of domestic abuse. But there are certain indicators through kind of research and evidence that are helpful in assessing and understanding risk. So these are things such as the frequency or the severity of abuse. So these are really helpful things for us to think about on the front line when we're working with somebody. These are indicators as well. These are not guarantees. These help paint part of a picture and help form our risk assessment in the immediate assessing of those risks. So frequency and severity of the abuse. Is it getting worse? Have the incidence and the severity of it, is the violence getting worse? Is the kind of coercion and control getting worse? Are they asking to check your phone all the time? Are they, when you're out and about, are they constantly video calling you? Are they constantly calling you? Are they asking you to send photos all of the time? Is there evidence of violence towards others? So kind of children or other family members or friends? Stalking and harassment. So this is in terms of one thing that is often the case when kind of violence and risks increase, or indicator of kind of risks is that they, as I said before, that they may constantly have to call the perpetrator when they're out and about, or the perpetrator may constantly call them. And they may set up tracking on their phone. There's a few different apps that basically allow somebody to be tracked, not just things like on iPhone, like Find My Friends or Apple ID, but there's one that was a weather app. And so when somebody opened up a weather app on their phone, it would show them the perpetrator where they were. So there are various kind of tools and ways that these kind of things happen. Another kind of thing that indicates high risk is if somebody has tried to leave the relationship before and they haven't, obviously indicates an ongoing nature and length of the abuse as well, and prevented from seeing other people, their support network or professionals. So often people become very isolated. They don't have anybody to talk to. They don't have anybody to turn to should they need to leave, should they need to exit. It's just them. And a really important thing to be aware of is that pregnancy and somebody who's recently given birth is also a higher risk factor. So often abuse can start or escalate when somebody becomes pregnant or in the months following, because they are no longer able to give the same time and energy to their partner, and we often see a spike and increase in violence and abuse at that point. And also access to money. Do they have any access to money? And I know that's kind of different in a context of maybe asylum support, or somebody has no recourse to public funds because maybe they don't have access to money at all. And so it's not kind of the same thing in, say, in a situation of somebody who's maybe working and, you know, should have money, but their partner takes it all. When we're working with people who may have no recourse to public funds, well, then they don't have access to money anyway. So it's always just being really mindful and reflective to not kind of suddenly react in a way. But it's just, these are things to be thinking about in the cases when you're talking with your manager, when you're talking with the safeguarding team. And if somebody is literally on the phone with you and you're getting your first disclosure of domestic abuse, these are just kind of helpful things that you can be thinking about in terms of that immediate assessment of risk when we're kind of working with people who maybe want to leave relationships or are saying. I think that is all on that section. I'm just going to triple check. Yeah, so we're not trained on the DASH risk assessment, but it's likely if a specialist domestic abuse service gets involved, they will be doing a DASH risk assessment as well. So it's just a helpful thing in terms of context and understanding. And we're now going to move into doing an activity where we think about this really practically, because it's one thing to kind of talk about these ideas, but this is a case study. These are the case studies that have been used throughout these trainings, have been kind of based on real examples. So we're going to split into two
groups.
Yeah, two groups. Do you want me to read it out and then go through the questions and then do it?
It'll take a couple of minutes if everybody wants to read the screen, if you can see it. I should be done very quickly. I'll put you in two different groups. So Sarah, you will be with group 1. It's the same questions for both. And I'll be in group 2. Okay. I'll give you a warning. We've got about 15 minutes to discuss in the group, and I'll take you back at the end of this at around 10 to 11. And if someone from each group can kindly take notes, and feedback is a plenary in the end. So does anybody want to start with some feedback? Maybe someone from Sarah's group?
Yeah, I did volunteer to give feedback on behalf of the group. So I've realised that I've written the notes in kind of quite a mixed order in terms of answering the questions, but I'll try and do it roughly logically. So in terms of 1, like, how would you assess if she's an immediate risk? I guess we talked about it in the end a little bit, and it was, I guess, about getting the information you might need to, because I guess from what she's told you, you have quite a lot of detail about abuse. Like, you've got an idea, you know, she's scared, there's shouting, she's talking quietly, you kind of got a sense that she's really quite worried. You might want to, I guess, first of all, work out if she's safe to talk on the phone right there. Is the partner there? Is he downstairs? Like, maybe try and get a bit of a sense of what the current situation is. If you can ask some more questions, ask closed questions, like actually kind of so she can say yes or no, like have you been hurt, is the baby been hurt, like try and get those that some a bit more of a picture. If someone raised the point, like asking if she's in a confidential space, if she can be called back, if she's saying she wants to leave today, there's a kind of sense that actually there is an urgency, and there is something that probably you need to kind of take it very seriously, because it's you're going with her kind of sense of fear, and I suppose what a question, how many steps you would again I sort of like, I think any steps you would take before you end the call, like you want to know if you can call back on the same number, if you can text, if it says if there are any other professionals involved, potentially there might be a health visitor. If there's a baby, there might be a midwife. Maybe it's useful to know that. Anyone else wants to jump in? I feel like I've missed out quite a lot of what we talked about, but that's roughly, I guess, what we said.
Maybe from our group, if somebody wants to add, I mean, we did discuss some of this as well. Yeah, does anybody want to add?
Yeah, actually, we also discussed more or less the same things. So we said what she has already told us shows that she is at immediate risk, because the husband doesn't want the baby, and then she wants to move. And then someone said that we should make sure, we should check if the husband is all abusing the baby as well, and to check if there is any physical violence has happened, and to check the frequency, how often it is happening. And we also said where she wants to move, and she has prepared all the things and packing the luggage that she wants to take with her. And then if we can talk to her later, if she wants to tell us more about her situation when the perpetrator is not there. And if we can check what serious thing has happened recently that she made the decision to leave. This is what I have noted from our discussion. I don't know if someone wants.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. Yeah, we discussed also practical steps, like if she's moved to a different city for a hotel, just very practical tips, not to tell the husband where she is, if that can be a risk. Checking the phone, and if she has access to some funds to get where if she's moving today. I think that covers all. Yeah, we discussed quite in detail the role of midwife, health visitor, as also, just to check if she disclosed to them, and also the importance of checking what she would like to happen today. I mean, she said she wants to move, obviously, but also check on her wishes, because she might have appointments in the hospital, and so she might need a little bit of help organizing things if she goes away from her local area.
If you're asking questions and you're trying to assess risk and the client is being deliberately vague in their answers, could that suggest that they are currently in an unsafe situation and that it's not safe for them to speak And so what you could be doing is suggesting that they get to a safe space and call you back later. So it's safe for them to disclose and it's safer for you to ask more questions around risk.
Yeah, definitely.
You've helpfully brought us on to kind of what we were going to talk about as well, is the difficulty in working from home and assessing those risks, whereas normally we would rely on a lot of physical non-verbal communication of somebody maybe not giving you eye contact, of somebody kind of presenting in a withdrawn way, but actually now we're assessing that over the phone. And if you know that person, obviously difficulty is if it's say somebody who we've never worked with before, that may be their normal presentation. But if this is somebody who you've worked with before, and just their tone of voice or their intonation or their answers or the way that they're speaking, as you were saying, Isaac, kind of actually it doesn't sit quite well. And we don't kind of, you know, our gut tells us a lot. You know, the kind of our gut feeling about something, we don't kind of necessarily like react to that straight away, kind of practically. But that's really helpful when you're kind of, why am I feeling uneasy about this case? Why is something not sitting well? And when you unpick it, it may be something to do with, well, actually, they weren't answering the questions. They would normally answer questions. They would normally speak quite freely. And that's, I think, a real difficulty that we have now. In maybe working from home more and not being able to do as much face-to-face, and the difficulties as caseworkers that adds a different dimension to our risk assessment. So we are relying on those other factors, like you say, Isaac.
I would just add that we have quite a bit of disclosure, and the first question would be like, is it too safe to speak now, to figure out if she's actually in a safe space. And like just adding on to what Sarah is just saying, and one option is to ask yes and no questions for immediate assessment, but then you would probably want to have a separate call if possible, but it might not be. So it's difficult to answer.
And I think it was Jess in our group who raised a really good point, and was saying about kind of the reality is that sometimes you have somebody who wants to leave and you're trying to get, because we were then talking about accommodation options, or if they want to leave, what would you say to them that you might be able to do, by the end of the day. And just kind of highlighting the reality is that sometimes the local authority or the Home Office or whatever doesn't come through in time, and so maybe they then don't leave on that day, and then, as Jess said, often the cycle kind of goes back to square one a bit, that then actually they then don't want to leave, and they maybe then say, well, actually no, fine, like it was just one off, like they'll change, they'll get better, like it's fine. And the kind of difficulties in that, and the kind of pressure that can feel, that knowing that when someone wants to leave, that can be a lot of pressure as well, to try and kind of work that out, which is why we want to talk through some of the practicalities as well. Does anybody have any kind of questions following on from the case study, or kind of talking through that at all before we go on to the next bit?
Can I just ask, like, I mean, this might be covered anyway, but if you get a real sense that, like, okay, she, like, the perpetrator's there, he's probably in the room, you're on the phone, she's saying it, or he's not in the room, but he's probably in the vicinity. You don't get a sense that you can call her back because she's kind of being vague, or she's kind of like, how do you need to kind of, I guess,
what
I don't know, it's so hard.
Where
basically,
there's no
it's so hard.
There's no disclosure. And this is kind of one of the things we're going to talk about now, is what do you do where, as a professional, you've got enough experience to realize that something doesn't feel quite right about this, you're concerned about this, and that's why the questions of knowing about other professionals who are involved is there a health visitor who can go and do a home visit, check in on the family? Are they in NAS accommodation? If they're in NAS accommodation, the housing officer can just do like a quick check on the accommodation, not for those not saying the reasons why they're going, but it's then thinking about those other things of, okay, police, you can do a police welfare check, but that can also create a lot of damage, because that can really escalate a situation unnecessarily and make it more unsafe. And obviously we don't want to cause further harm to somebody, and so that kind of has to be really thought about if you were going to do that. But that's where the whole thing about thinking about the other professionals who are involved, who might be able to do who else is involved? If there's a health visitor involved, would they be able to go around and do a check? Are there any other support workers or professionals involved? What accommodation are they in? If they're in NAS, could the housing officer go around? And they often go around anyway, so that's not an uncommon thing to kind of not raise suspicion, but to just check on the situation. And I've done that before, where I've been really concerned about something, and I've got someone from Clear Springs to go around and do something quite generic, explain the situation, and they just did something quite generic, like a general thing that they would normally do, just to get an overview of that, of the situation. But that's a really difficult thing as well. I don't know if anybody else has any other kind of things they wanted to say on that.
I'm just listening to you and thinking, if this woman has phoned us and said she is really in danger and it seems like she wants to leave right now, if I was to phone, in my experience, if I was to phone Clear Springs, the housing manager, the number of times I'm not able to get hold of the house manager for a house, that will probably take maybe a day or two before I can find her, and then she might be busy, she won't be able to make it. I could try and get hold of the midwife or the health visitor, but again, going through possibly the GP, that might be difficult. So I'm thinking all the things are actually weighed against this poor woman. Now, I work in partnership with a women's refuge. They refer clients to us for our project. Would it be okay for me to contact them and just make them aware of this case?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're not, as in just in terms of for advice or space. Yeah, I mean, if sometimes I've called the National Domestic Abuse Helpline just for advice about a case. I've given no names, no situations, and asked for advice from a specialist. That's a really good idea, to ask for advice from a specialist. You can't go wrong with asking for advice. We are going to jump in a bit to the new domestic abuse guidance from the Home Office, which basically means that there is a different provision now available, that they should be moved immediately through Clear Springs, through housing officers. And we know that there's difficulties with this being implemented. The Red Cross are working with ASAP and Refugee Council to implement this, or see the implementation of it done well, because we know on the ground that we've got this guidance which allows for a provision of immediate exit should somebody want to, but in practice this isn't happening. And in practice, there are barriers to this, and opportunities are being missed because people don't know it, who need to know it. In theory, you should be able to call the Clear Springs housing officer and their safeguarding team, and they should find accommodation immediately if there's domestic abuse, and they should be moved immediately should they want to be. That is what the guidance says. The reality of that is sometimes a bit different, and that's kind of why we're feeding into this, but that should be there as a provision, but we know the reality is sometimes different to guidance kind of says. Are there any other points before we kind of jump onto the next bit, kind of just talking about our casework response? Perfect. Okay, so obviously, as I kind of keep saying over and over again, we're not domestic abuse specialists, but it's really important that we have a good enough idea about the risks and how to assess those and put kind of immediate things in place pending getting referrals in place, and all of those things that you have spoken about and the points that you've raised and the questions that you were asked it's really talking about best practice. Those are the things that we want to do, and we are going to send a handout with those questions and key things that you can ask to assess risk and what to do in those situations, because it's sometimes in the moment it's having that to hand of a really like step by step without all of the kind of jargon of it as well. Obviously, in any of these cases, we'll be speaking to safeguarding, and so that's kind of a given that you're not there on your own trying to work out how to assess risk and how to put this in place. Our safeguarding team are amazing, and actually we go to them in all of these situations and they kind of have experience in this as well. So kind of the Red Cross approach is to recognise, I always get it the wrong way around, recognise, support, refer. But reality is, even after the point of referral, maybe to a domestic abuse specialist, we're not necessarily going to stop our involvement, and we might still be involved as well. And ultimately, the underpinning of all of this is a person-centered approach. And this was kind of highlighted in our group as well. I know kind of in this situation, the service users are saying they want to leave, but we have to work with that person and what they want to do. We tailor our support according to their needs and to their wishes. Obviously, there's safeguarding and those kind of things as well. If they're at immediate risk of harm, and that's where you go to safeguarding, and they'll advise you. I'm not going to kind of get into the ins and outs of that today, but a person-centered approach is pivotal. And it's really important as professionals and as practitioners and caseworkers, whatever our title is, that we're reflective about what we do. Often the phrase is thrown around, do no harm. And people can often be very reactive in cases of domestic abuse that can actually cause harm, where someone doesn't want to leave or they're not ready to leave, or put them in a situation that creates further risk. And as an organisation, we want to be ones where we know enough. We're not a specialist, but we know enough so that we're not putting people at further risk, and we're actually supporting them into safety, whatever that looks like for them. Because safety looks different for every single person and every individual that we work with, which then kind of, I guess, ties back into that whole person-centered approach. And being reflective means to really think about those risks, and being reflective means thinking about things like, their tone of voice and those other things in their presentation. It's thinking about our own worries about a case, because I think often they do impact the way that we act, because it can feel it's not our responsibility, but we can feel really responsible for keeping that person safe. We're not a statutory organisation, but we often feel like we are. I know other people might feel like that as well. And it's really important that we kind of reflect consistently on the actions we're taking them, why we're taking them, and consistently speak to safeguarding. Obviously data entry is very important in domestic abuse cases, just because it might be called on in any sort of form of kind of evidence, and we need to make sure that our notes are fully up to date, and everything is recorded effectively on the wonderful new BRM system they've kindly updated for us, and just make sure that it is accurate recording, and whereas possible, I try to do like verbatim. So as somebody, the questions that I ask and exactly what they responded, not always possible, but where possible, that's always a really kind of good way where you can obviously kind of do it as they're talking as well. But it's really important that we have an accurate record of what we have done and what we've tried to do, of who we've contacted, and the conversations that have happened around cases. And obviously that is all reported on Datix, but I know that the safeguarding team are well equipped to talk about that as well. I'm just seeing if there's anything else I missed on that. We've spoken about kind of barriers as well in working from home and the difficulties in some of those. And I think in terms of also the person-centered approach is not pushing for a disclosure. We're talking about when people maybe, when you're worried about a situation but somebody hasn't disclosed, and sometimes it is a really hard situation of there's concerns but not enough to warrant maybe any other action at this point. And obviously you'll speak to safeguarding and they'll give advice on this, but that can be a really difficult space to hold, and it's really important to acknowledge that and reflect on how that makes us feel as professionals. That's a really difficult space to hold because you're holding a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty, and it's then what can we do to make ourselves feel more safe and make that person more safe as well. And not to push for a disclosure, but to build a relationship, to build a working relationship of trust with that person, which I know at the moment is a bit more challenging because we're working from home and we don't have that same face-to-face, which was much easier, maybe in some respects, to build that. And also don't push for somebody to leave. We know that not everybody wants to leave immediately. We know that people are likely to return. We don't want to push for somebody to leave. If they've disclosed it, we can explain their options to them. But we will never advise that somebody has to leave that situation. Obviously within safeguarding as well, in the context, that's like my caveat to everything that I'm saying as well, safeguarding team. And, you know, what do they want to happen next? It's their choice, where they've had so many choices taken away from them. What do they want to happen next? Which can also be really difficult when we're actually speaking about the practical options that are available for some. And a really important position that we hold at the Red Cross is that we validate what people say, and we believe if they're disclosing something, that we believe them. And in terms of safety plan, it is then thinking about some really practical things which have already been covered, but advising that they can call 999 if they want to, and if they call 999 really practically but can't speak, you can press the number 5, and that alerts the police that you're in like immediate risk as well, and they can kind of search. I don't know how they do it, but I think they can track your phone or whatever kind of the situation is as well. So there's kind of different options, and contacting any form of like domestic abuse specialist to refer on to as well, whatever they are locally, because they depend where you are, what local authority you're in, but contacting them as well. But these are just the bits of how we can hold it before somebody else is involved. Right, I'm now going to move on to, sorry, this is a mass bit of me speaking, so if anybody has any questions and wants to interrupt my speaking, then please feel free. I'll put them in the chat and I'll try and keep an eye on it as we're going along, because I know it's a lot of information that we're kind of giving you and talking about at the moment. Virginia, were you going to say something then?
No, absolutely.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
The next part maybe can be more open to discussion.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of options for people, does somebody know if somebody says, okay, I want to leave? I've also just realized that I meant to not put this slide up beforehand to ask this question, but if somebody forget what you just saw.
Just to help you a little bit.
I'm telling you, it's absolutely seamless. Quickly go back, Virginia. No, go back one slide, and I'll go into them more in a second. So if somebody wants to leave, having seen the slide that comes next, does anybody know, like, practically what rights and entitlements would be for somebody who rights and entitlements and barriers to getting it? Does anybody know, say if somebody is an asylum seeker, what they are entitled to, what is their option if they want to leave, and what would be the difficulty in them getting that?
We've just seen your slide, but earlier on, I was under the impression that if you had no recourse to public funds, you would find it really difficult for them to get any access into any even sheltered refuges, because they haven't got funding.
So the Home Office last summer, I think it was July 2019, brought out their domestic abuse guidance, and it basically has now given the provision for those who are asylum seekers, so are entitled to Section 4 support or Section 95, Section 98, are entitled to a refuge space. The Home Office will fund that space. So this is still teething issues in how you get it, and obviously, you know, you can't often get, practically you can't get a refuge space on the same day. Like, realistically, that is very rare, so you might be put in maybe Section 98 or emergency accommodation before going into one. But there is now the provision, so if somebody is an asylum seeker, they are entitled to a refuge space. Yes, in answer to your question. Okay, so just to kind of carry on, if somebody is an asylum seeker, ASAP brought out a really good fact sheet of practically how you access a refuge space or safe alternative accommodation. A refuge isn't maybe always the safest place for somebody who is exiting domestic abuse. It isn't always the best option for them. It's not always what they want. It's amazing for some people, and you know, the best form of safety, but for some people, you know, you can't disclose your address to anybody, nobody's allowed to come and visit you. Some people feel really isolated when they go into a refuge and actually see a real deterioration in their mental health. It's just not something that everybody will benefit from, but there is still the provision for if somebody is an asylum seeker to be moved into safe alternative accommodation. There also used to be a barrier if somebody was dependent on a partner's asylum claim, that they then couldn't access accommodation because it was tied up to that person's asylum support. But the Home Office, in light of their domestic abuse guidance, have now kind of changed their position on that. So if somebody is, say for example, the person we were speaking about in the case study, she wanted to leave with her child, but she's a dependent on his asylum claim and asylum support. She is able to access her own asylum support, and given a bit of breathing time, the Home Office should not be, and that's their position, that they're not putting a specific time scale on when they have to seek their own legal advice. They're given kind of breathing space, and they were putting a 6-week window, but that's been scrapped now because that was said, like, that's not fair. You can't put that window on somebody of when they have to seek advice. And it's also not practical because you can't often get legal advice, maybe even within 6 weeks. So there is now that kind of provision that before wasn't there for somebody to kind of exit. So if somebody has asylum support, or is an asylum seeker eligible for asylum support, they should be able to access accommodation immediately. Now, the practical way that you do this, there's various steps, and I'm not going to go through kind of step by step because ASAP's fact sheet is amazing and it does go through step by step. This is what you do, this is who you contact, this is who does what. I think it might have been sent out in one of the links for the pre-reading, but I think we can resend through all of these things afterwards as well, Virginia, if that's okay. Maybe we can resend them all.
Excuse me. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. In the case we just discussed, the lady who wanted to move because of the abuse happening, the asylum seeker was the husband, and the wife was just a dependent. So if she wants to move, she can't simply apply for accommodation support. Rather, her first step would be to approach the Home Office and apply for the asylum first.
Yeah.
And then after that, the asylum, because she would have no status if she's separated from her husband.
Yeah, so this is the thing. So this is the new provision that they've allowed. So that was the old way that they used to work it, but this is now the new provision. Is that if somebody wants to exit abuse, but they were a dependent on somebody else's asylum claim, they're now able to access alternative accommodation, because status shouldn't be a barrier to somebody accessing safety, is the position. So yes, that used to be the position and a real barrier, but the Home Office have changed their position on that. So that person in that case study would be able to access alternative accommodation, even though she doesn't have an asylum claim in her own right at that point.
So if according to the new provision, she can access the accommodation, and then the next step will be to apply for asylum?
Yeah, so then she would need to seek legal advice about her situation. She may decide, to return to the partner. She may decide that she doesn't want to claim her asylum in her own right, but there isn't a time scale in which she has to seek that legal advice or put an asylum application in. They haven't put a time scale on that, which is really good. So there is a bit of a breathing window for her to think about her options and think about what she wants to do and what she wants to happen next.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's if somebody is an asylum seeker. If somebody has refugee status and they have recourse to public funds. Now, if they have refugee status kind of in their own right and they didn't come on family reunion, then they can kind of access accommodation through the local authority or a refuge space. In that sense, it's the provision is more kind of obvious and straightforward. Obviously, if somebody is on a family reunion visa, that can be, and coming on family reunion, that can create real difficulties and real barriers to accessing safety. And obviously, we always advise that we're not legal advisors, and they need to seek, or we can support them to seek legal advice at any point. And then kind of with NRPF options, I think kind of Teresa, you highlighted this as well. It's really difficult if somebody has no recourse to public funds. The options of safety for that person of wanting to leave is really difficult. NRPF spaces are in short supply. There's some amazing organisations like locally in each area that have accommodations, but the reality is that they are in such short supply that it can be really difficult, and there aren't a lot of options when somebody has no recourse to public funds, and it's going through those local connections and partnerships that we have with charities that have maybe NRPF spaces and NRPF accommodations, and that's kind of the really difficult kind of reality for individuals in that situation. I think we're moving on to the next
If she stays?
slide. Yeah, okay, so if somebody decides that they want to stay, obviously this is quite common. If you're working with somebody and they said, actually, I don't want to leave, I want to stay in this situation, then
or returns,
or return, then it's actually about having those safe things in place. Some of the things that we spoke about and mentioned earlier as part of our risk assessment and a part of our way of having a bit of a safety plan, not in the kind of formal sense, but just in terms of good casework practice. So these are things that we've kind of mentioned before, is having a safe word. So if you call somebody and they can't speak, or they are at immediate risk, having a safe word or phrase such as "I need to go to the toilet." You agree on that at a different time, but that's a really practical way, because if you're worried that the perpetrator is always around and they can rarely speak by themselves, how do you assess if they are at immediate risk? If you've got a safe word / phrase, which when they say that, you know they are at immediate risk of harm, and that means they want to leave, then that's a really good way of having that in place as well. Another way is to text before calling. If you know that the perpetrator doesn't check their phone, is that you can ask them, okay, can I text you before I call you to check that you're by yourself and you're in a confidential space. Checking if somebody has any money on them, if they need to leave, or if we can kind of give any provision in that sense if they are NRPF as well. And I think this was mentioned earlier, do they have a bag packed? Or would that be really obvious and that be a risk factor if they were to pack a bag and the perpetrator were to see, why have you got a bag packed? These are really practical things. Do they have credit on their phone, and is their phone charged? I know these are really practical things, but these are things just to think about if somebody's in that situation. We know there's lots of risks, and we can never maybe get rid of those risks, but we can put some other things in place that make it just a tiny bit safer. It's not going to stop everybody. Just something that we can kind of consider as well. And kind of one more thing, sorry, just back one slide, Virginia.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Is if the service user wants to, we can flag the address of the police and their phone number. Now this is through kind of 101, and this means that if they call from that number and they call 99, it means that the police would attend immediately because they know that they are at immediate risk. But it's also not uncommon for somebody not to want to get police involvement. Also things like avoiding the kitchen if there's a kitchen escalates, because there can often be a lot of knives and weapons in those situations, and the importance of talking through all of this with safeguarding, but also speaking with specialist agencies as well. You know, we can call up the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. You know, it's a free phone number, and I sometimes call them up and just ask for advice. I speak through a case. Is there any other things? You know, I had it the other week where I had somebody who was returning to live with the perpetrator, and I called them for further advice and said, is there anything else that we need to do in terms of our safety planning? Is there anything else that you would advise, just kind of from a specialist organizational point of view, for advice, but also refer. We're not a specialist organization, as I keep saying. We do a lot of specialist work, which also I want to acknowledge as well, that the Red Cross and all of you do incredible work, and a lot of really specialist, highly skilled work, but ultimately we're not a specialist organization. And there are others that we can work alongside in this, and it's important that we have enough of an understanding to be able to act safely with those that we're working with, and to remain person-centered, because we will be working with those who want to stay in a situation that is, you know, that they're staying in a situation where there's a lot of risks, and there is abuse. Does anybody have any questions on the kind of huge spiel of information that I've just given you? Any points or comments or things kind of practically?
Yeah, just Sarah just reminded me that, yeah, your role is a full-time Women in Crisis role, and not all areas do have that. So some of this will not be practically possible, and that you don't have to take it all on you. But yes, some of these tips can, you hopefully through this training in this scenario, can give you an idea on practical tips. And what if she leaves? What, you know, what if she decides not to leave in the end or returns later? And that we cover the basics of that. And yes, the safeguarding team highlighted that they're there also for your practical support in that respect.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing of reflective casework practice is pivotal. And sitting down and mapping out cases and doing that with your manager, doing that with the safeguarding team. What are all of my concerns? What are the things that I don't have any evidence for, but I don't feel comfortable with? Is often what we're working with. I don't feel comfortable with the situation. There's something about the situation that doesn't feel right. Putting those things down on paper and then working out how you're going to address those can be a really practical way of kind of building up that picture in the long term, and having those kind of case mapping tools that we use in our supervision sessions with our managers, that we talk through with safeguarding as well, in terms of making sure that we have kind of covered all the bases and are sitting back and taking a step back as well, is really important, that we're constantly reflecting on our own actions and ensuring that we're listening to the kind of, you know, to the views of those people that we're working with.
Any other questions? I know we're slightly over time, but not too bad. Thanks, a few people who left. So what I will do is I will send you some material handouts from today, and the PowerPoint slide will be useful for those who left and to leave a bit earlier. And there'll be an evaluation form. Just as a reminder, it's a link to Google Forms. To Microsoft Forms. Please fill them in. This is an implementation session. We want to improve them for the future. So if you attended all, please use the 3 links that I sent after each session. If you just attended this, will be really, really useful. And I'll send a reminder if you don't get enough responses. So please, that would be great. Any questions? I didn't see any in the chat. Any final points? No, everybody's saying bye. So we'll end this.
Yeah, we'll end the recording now, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email us or ask us, or just stay on now as well, because I'll be on here for the next 5 or so minutes. So yeah, feel free to stay on.